Stop what you are doing right now. I need you to actually hear what I'm about to say. 30 days. That is the number. Around 30 days of usable fuel reserves is what America has left. Not months, not weeks, in any comfortable sense of the word. 30 days. And if the pressure on global supply does not ease, we are not talking about paying more at the pump. We're talking about rationing, actual fuel rationing across the United States, in cities, in rural towns, in farming communities that run entirely on diesel to keep food moving. The crisis in front of us right now is a supply crisis at its core. There is not enough fuel getting through. And the response from the people who are supposed to be managing this situation has been reactive at every single turn. By the time task forces get assembled and reserve releases get announced publicly, the damage is already baked in. Reports of wholesale diesel and gasoline rationing are already coming out of certain regional markets right now. Farmers in fuel-dependent communities are already feeling this. Already. But what if I told you the fuel is not even the biggest problem anymore? What if while every camera is pointed at gas stations and every headline is running pump prices, something far more serious is developing in complete silence? What if the fuel crisis is already converting itself into a food crisis and the window to get ahead of it is closing fast? Because that is precisely what is happening. The signals are already there for anyone willing to read them. So here's the question that actually matters. How does an American household absorb a fuel crisis and a food crisis at the same time? How does a family that is already squeezed on rent, on energy bills, on groceries, on interest rates, handle another pressure point dropping on top of all of that simultaneously? And how did we get here? What decisions were made or deliberately not made that put us in this position? That is exactly what I want to walk through. The global picture, the mechanics of how fuel drives food production problems, how that chain reaction ends up in your cart at the register, and what the real financial impact looks like on your household in the coming weeks. And at the end, I'm going to lay out the 3 specific ways the government has already failed this situation and the exact mistakes being made right now that could push a supply problem into something much harder to pull back from. Let me be straight with you about something before we go further. This is one of those situations where I genuinely cannot tell you with certainty where it ends. Things are moving every single day, and every time you think the fuel situation is the worst of it, something else shows up. That is not dramatic framing. That is the pattern of the last several weeks. And right now, the next thing that has shown up is food. American households are staring at a second pressure point, and it is building fast. Think about what is already on the table for the average American household right now. Rising interest rates, housing pressure that is not going away, rents climbing at record pace, energy bills going up, wages not keeping up with any of it, and sitting on top of all of that, fuel shortages and the very serious risk of food shortages emerging at the same time. At what point does someone in authority actually acknowledge that people have absorbed enough and start putting meaningful solutions in place? Farmers have been raising these exact concerns for weeks, and it has landed on deaf ears. While every news cycle was locked on fuel prices and empty pumps, farmers were already saying clearly that if this continues, food is next. They identified the risk early. They asked for support early. Nothing happened. And here is the part that should concern you most about what the government is saying right now. When fuel prices first started climbing seriously, the official line was calm, measured, supply was stable, nothing to worry about. And then within days, those same voices announced emergency reserve releases, crisis task forces, new sourcing frameworks. Gas stations in parts of the country were running dry while the reassurances were still fresh. So now those same officials are saying there is no serious concern about food supply. And I think it is a completely legitimate question to ask whether that statement deserves any trust at all. Because if the pattern holds, and the pattern has held consistently, the reassurance comes first. The emergency measures follow, and by the time the emergency measures arrive, the window for early action has already closed. Can you see that pattern? Because it is not subtle anymore. That is exactly why this breakdown matters right now, not after the fact. Now, while the early window is still open. Almost every food crisis that emerges in the modern global economy traces back to the same starting point: energy. That connection is not coincidental. It is structural. Right now, because of the conflict in the Middle East, global fuel supply is under serious pressure. When fuel prices move up, the cost of producing anything moves with them. Food sits dead center in that equation in ways most people never think about during normal times. Oil moves the ships that carry cargo between continents. It runs the trucks that deliver goods across state lines. It powers the equipment that plants and harvests every crop across every agricultural state in this country. And here is the piece that almost never reaches a mainstream conversation. Oil is a direct input in producing fertilizer, specifically urea, one of the most critical fertilizers used in large-scale agriculture globally. Oil and fertilizer are not separate supply chains. They are deeply connected. When one gets disrupted, the other follows. The same conflict squeezing oil supply is directly hitting fertilizer supply. A massive share of the world's urea production is based in the Middle East. A significant portion of that urea moves through the Strait of Hormuz to reach global markets. When that shipping corridor is under pressure, fertilizer becomes harder to get, more expensive, and slower to arrive. And those consequences do not appear on your grocery receipt immediately. They show up months later when harvest yields come in short. Global institutions are already signaling where this leads. The World Food Program, the largest humanitarian organization in the world dealing with hunger response, has already stated publicly that if this conflict continues, up to 45 million people could fall into acute hunger. That is not a fringe projection. That is the World Food Program on record. And the United Nations trade body has separately confirmed that rising fuel costs, fertilizer shortages, and surging freight rates are all reinforcing each other and will push global food prices higher everywhere. The United States is part of this system. We are not shielded from global supply chain disruptions. The question is not whether this reaches American consumers. The question is how fast. The food crisis building right now is not coming from one direction. It is coming from two separate pressure points landing at the same time. Two simultaneous disruptions do not just add together. They compound each other. Pressure point one is fertilizer. Without fertilizer, there is no large-scale food production. That is the full sentence. And here is the number that almost nobody in the general public knows. The United States imports roughly 90 to 96% of its urea fertilizer. More than half of that supply comes from the Middle East. A country with hundreds of millions of acres of farmland imports 90 to 96% of the fertilizer that makes those farms productive. And the majority of that supply comes from the exact region currently at the center of a global conflict. That structural vulnerability has existed for years without being seriously addressed. This is not in the morning briefings. You are not seeing it at the bottom of the screen. But it is more consequential than the fuel price at the pump. Fuel prices hurt your budget this week. Fertilizer shortages determine how much food exists 6 months from now. Here's what makes fertilizer so hard to work around on short notice. Farming does not operate on a flexible timeline. There are specific planting windows for every crop. Miss the window and you do not get a second attempt. The season is gone. If a farmer in the Corn Belt or the Wheat Belt cannot access fertilizer in time or cannot afford fertilizer at current prices, the crop either does not get planted or gets planted at drastically reduced input levels. The yield comes in short. That shortage does not stay on the farm. It moves through every layer of the food supply chain until it shows up as a higher price or an empty shelf at your grocery store. Put yourself in the position of a farmer right now. Diesel costs are elevated, every input cost is up. Fertilizer is either unavailable or priced at levels that break the economics. You are still putting in the same labor, carrying the same debt, exposed to the same weather risk that farming always carries. But the output at the end of all of it is significantly lower. When costs go up and yield goes down at the same time, there is a threshold where continuing at the same production level stops making financial sense. Farmers are approaching that threshold right now. Farmers have already said publicly that if fertilizer shortages continue through the critical planting windows this season, Output in some commodity categories could be cut by 50%. These are producers describing the arithmetic of their own operations. Pressure point 2 is fuel and freight. This is the one that connects directly to what you pay at the register every single week. Every stage of food production in this country runs on diesel: planting, harvesting, cold storage, interstate trucking, last-mile delivery to distribution centers and retail stores. When diesel prices go up, that cost does not disappear somewhere between the farm and the shelf. It gets embedded into every single step. A transport company adding a fuel surcharge to a delivery route passes that cost to the distributor passes it to the retailer passes it to you. Every link in the chain does the same thing. It passes the cost forward, and you are at the end of that chain. What this creates is a compounding cost structure hitting from both ends at once. Farmers are producing less because of fertilizer constraints, while the cost of whatever they do produce is higher because diesel is driving up every step from the field to the shelf. Less supply and higher costs produce the same outcome every single time. Higher prices for you. Walmart is not going to absorb those losses. Kroger is not going to either. None of the major retailers are in the business of absorbing cost increases out of goodwill. When their costs go up, your bill goes up. Every time. So the scenario building right now is genuinely two-sided. Less food on the shelf, and the food that is there costs more than it did a few weeks ago. You walk in expecting to pick up something basic, milk, eggs, bread, and you are either paying significantly more than expected, or you are looking at a shelf that is not fully stocked. This is not a hypothetical. Transport companies are already adding surcharges to daily delivery routes right now. Farmers have been specific about which categories move first. Dairy is expected to show visible price pressure earliest. Milk prices could rise 30 to 50 cents per gallon in the near term. From there, the pressure moves through fresh produce, eggs, meat, and grain-based products like bread. All of those categories share the same dependency on fuel, fertilizer, and freight at multiple points in the chain. The timeline farmers describe is not months out. They are saying this starts showing up within weeks. Based on what is already happening with transport surcharges, that process has already begun. Now I want to share something that is going to land hard, because it puts all of this into a context that makes it significantly more serious. The food security picture in America was already under serious strain before any of this started. This is not a stable system getting hit by an unexpected shock. This is a system that was already under pressure, getting hit by additional shocks on top of existing ones. Before the current disruptions began, approximately 1 in 3 American households was already dealing with some form of food insecurity. 1 in 3. That means people were already cutting back on food spending, already switching to lower quality options to make budgets work, already in some cases skipping meals to stay within a budget that was not stretching far enough. That baseline reality existed before fuel got tight, before fertilizer supply came under pressure. Before any of this current situation developed, the government was not operating without information here. The signals existed. Food banks running over capacity, agricultural economists flagging input cost pressures months ago, advocacy organizations publishing household food budget data. The information was available. The urgency was not matched to it. The people who are going to feel the next wave of pressure the hardest are the ones who were already closest to the edge. Retirees living on fixed Social Security income with no flexibility to absorb cost increases across multiple spending categories at once. Working families already spending a serious share of their monthly income on food before any of these price movements began. Rural communities where supply chain disruptions arrive faster and hit harder because the logistics margin is smaller to begin with. These are not abstractions. These are specific populations, and the policy response is not being visibly designed around protecting them first. And here is the government pattern that makes all of this more concerning. When fuel prices first started rising seriously, the official response was calm and reassuring. Supply was stable, nothing to worry about. Within days, those same officials were back announcing emergency reserve releases and crisis task forces. Gas stations were running dry in real time, while the reassurances were still fresh in people's minds. So when those same voices now say food supply is stable and there is no serious concern, it is completely fair to ask whether that should be trusted at all. The pattern is consistent. The downplaying comes first. The emergency measures follow when the situation can no longer be denied. And by the time the emergency measures arrive, the early intervention window has closed. We are in the early window right now with food. There is no clear plan being communicated to the public. There is no visible proactive engagement with the agricultural sector. Farmers who have been raising specific concrete concerns for weeks have not received meaningful responses. If the same approach taken with fuel gets taken with food, by the time this is treated as urgent at the policy level, the situation will have already moved past the point where early action could have contained it. That is mistake number one: dismissing early signals that have a track record of being correct. Mistake number two is the absence of any emergency fertilizer strategy. Given that 90 to 96% of urea imports originate through a region currently in active conflict, an emergency domestic sourcing framework should already be active. That conversation is not happening publicly. Mistake number three is the failure to protect the planting window. Every week that passes without a concrete fertilizer supply response is a week closer to planting deadlines that cannot be moved. When those windows close, the yield consequences for the entire growing season are locked in. You cannot undo a missed planting window. It is gone for that season. Now let me be precise about something, because I want you to have the right picture here. I am not telling you that America is going to run out of food. The country is not heading towards starvation. That is not what is happening. What I'm saying is that the early warning signals are real, the structural vulnerabilities are documented, and the supply chain pressures are already active. If the right responses happen in the next few weeks, if fertilizer supply gets secured for critical planting windows, if supply chains stabilize, if policy moves ahead of this rather than behind it, this is still a manageable situation. The window is open right now, but it is not permanent. When I use the word crisis here, I am not talking about empty shelves and people going without food. I am talking about prices rising so fast and so far that a meaningful share of American households already managing carefully get pushed into genuinely difficult financial territory. That is the version of this that early action can still prevent. In the meantime, the most practical thing anyone can do is support domestic food producers. Buy American-grown produce where it is available. That keeps money inside the domestic agricultural economy and provides some buffer for the producers carrying this situation without much support from above. Situations like this one have a way of clarifying something that stable periods allow people to avoid thinking about. You cannot hand off responsibility for your financial security to anyone else, not to a government, not to a policy response, not to a system that has shown repeatedly that its first instinct is to manage perception rather than manage the problem. This is not a political statement about any party or administration. It is a pattern observation. Across administrations and across party lines, the response to supply disruptions is reactive. The warnings come early, the action comes late, and the households that absorb the most damage are the ones that were already closest to the edge when the disruption arrived. That reality points to one practical conclusion: build the kind of financial stability that does not depend on others acting correctly or quickly. Cash buffers. Spending flexibility in the categories most vulnerable to supply disruptions. Food, fuel, and energy are the three categories where disruptions translate fastest into household financial stress. Decisions made now, before the full pressure arrives, are worth significantly more than the same decisions made in the middle of a crisis. Because here is what the pattern keeps showing. These disruptions do not come once and then disappear. They come in cycles. The specific trigger changes. The underlying dynamic does not. The gap between households that come through a period like this in a solid position and households that come through barely holding on usually traces back to one difference: the decisions that were made before the situation peaked. Not during it, before it. The time to build that position is right now, while the window is still open. Think about that. Because every financial decision you make over the coming weeks is going to be made in the context of what is building right now, whether you are thinking about it or not. The question is whether you are making those decisions with clear eyes or waiting to react after the fact, like the policy response always does. Does it feel to you like this situation is being managed the way it should be? Or does it feel like we are watching the beginning of another problem that had solutions available weeks ago, solutions that are not being used? That question is worth sitting with.